You know what's scarier than the woods? Dark woods. Turn out those forest lights and bam, the terror of the unknown surrounds you. The worst kinds of critters start coming alive, and no matter what direction you run, it might lead you right into the maw of your demise. To celebrate such a terrifying fate, I have for you today some allegedly true and creepy stories that take place in the bowels of the woods. If you have a story, be sure to share it with us at darkstories.org for a chance to have it narrated. Also, I've got a permanent link to my Discord if you want to join us and listen in on future interviews, or you just want to hang out. Click that link below. Now, let's begin. The Man in the Smiley Mask, from Nolan A. The woods have always been my safe place. They were when I was 8 years old. I was a bullied kid. Now that I'm 20 years old, the woods still are my safe place, but that all changed about a week ago. My house is in a fairly suburban area, just a few minutes of a walk from a forest that was barely saved from removal by locals. The area is known as Weona Park. Those woods are a favorite of joggers and people just out for a stroll, especially in the fall, when nature is at her best. I'd gotten home early from work one day and decided to take an hour to enjoy the forest, so I put on my coat, walked down the hill to the entrance of the woods. The leaves made that satisfying crunch underneath my feet, and the colors reminded me of Thanksgiving. I popped in my headphones and played a couple of old Billy Joel songs, my favorites. Life seemed good. Eventually, I realized that I only had a bit left to walk, so I took a turn to go deeper into the woods. I continued to walk, but then my music suddenly cut out. I took my headphones out, checked the connection. Then I checked the battery on my device. Everything seemed fine. But now that I could hear my surroundings, I couldn't hear my surroundings because everything had gone eerily quiet. And it was dark, too. A little too dark for an early afternoon. I placed my headphones back into my ears and I tried to play more music, but what came out instead of music caused me to jump. It was a loud burst of static that stabbed into my ear canals. "What the hell?" I muttered, breathing heavily, yanking out the headphones again. A moment later, that phrase I'd just spoken was echoed around me. "What the hell?" I was dumbstruck. That didn't seem like a normal echo, so I tested it with a whistle. And a moment later, I heard the echo again of my exact whistle. Only once again it did not sound like a proper echo. It was as if someone was recording me, mocking me. I looked around and I saw nothing but the darkness of the forest. My phone then vibrated, and I looked down to see a text from a number I did not recognize. I opened it. It was a picture of me, standing right where I was then, looking down at my phone. The picture was taken only a few seconds ago, from my left. I quickly glanced in that direction, but saw nothing. The picture hadn't been taken from very far away, and it was still light enough for me to see a couple of yards in front of me, so something should have been there. I should have seen someone, at least, taking photos. My phone vibrated again, and I glanced back down to see another picture of me, this time from the right. I freaked out and backed from that direction. I texted back, "Who are you?" I received another picture of me. I began to back away from the deeper area of the woods. My heart was pounding and my innards felt like ice. I had no idea where the person was, but I needed to know, because if I ran in the wrong direction, I could be heading right towards them. I called their number, and I waited to hear a ring. My phone said, "Connecting," and I waited. Then I heard a ring behind me. My heart leapt into my throat, and my legs went weak. I slowly turned to face the sound, but the ringing stopped as my eyes fell on someone. They were over 6 feet tall, much taller than I was. I remember them wearing a black tactical jacket and a hoodie. But what I mostly focused on was their mask. It was yellow and it had a tight smile with square teeth, 2 squinting eyes, but no nose. It looked like some kind of demonic emoji. I screamed and I ran, following the trail I used to love. I didn't stop running until I made it home. Every time I'd look back, I'd see them not too far behind me, but somehow I never saw them run. They would just be standing still, watching me. I had never been so scared in my life. When I got home, I fumbled with the keys and I ran inside. That was the most terrifying moment of my life. It was the kind of feeling where you curved your back and you pushed all your force forward just to get away. Once I was inside, I locked all the doors and windows. Then I grabbed a knife and I stayed in bed for the rest of the night, waiting, listening. To this day, I never went back into those woods. I bought a new phone too. Even though I deleted those texts, I didn't want him to be able to contact me or find me. Sometimes, though, I do walk a little close to those woods, and I find myself staring at the trees, trembling, and I wonder who or what was behind that mask. Skinwalker Encounters from Dread 445, Part 1. I'm a Native American from the Navajo tribe. I lived on the Navajo reservation near Four Corners for about 8 years, and I knew about skinwalkers. I knew about them my whole life. My family always told me not to talk about them, not to mention anything about them, as it is said to attract them, but I did anyways with my cousins. We didn't care as much as our elders did, but maybe we should have. Back then, I wondered why people were so afraid of them, these skinwalkers or gloshies. You always hear about people freaking out the moment they come across one or hear one, but that's what they do. They like to scare people. Because in reality, skinwalkers aren't supposed to be able to harm you. Not physically, not if you're not afraid of them. The worst they can do is blow powder in your face and get you sick for a while, or try to curse you. But there are ways to get rid of a skinwalker, like using ashes from a fireplace and sprinkling them around your home, or you can keep a pouch of them and throw it at them if the time comes. That's the way I've always been told. I learned it all from my grandfather, who is a medicine man, so naturally I took his lesson. He still practices his medicine man career, doing peyote ceremonies and other things, some of which I don't remember well, but he always warned us about not going out at night. I've had what I believe to be 3 separate encounters with skinwalkers, and now I know that whole don't go out at night thing is something I should definitely take more seriously. The first encounter happened when I was 6. Me and my mother were driving to a city near us because we lived out in the hills about 50 miles from the nearest town. My mother ended up forgetting to fuel up from the day before, so we were stuck on the road waiting for anyone to pick us up. But no one came, and my mother told me we would have to walk back home. Then we could call my father to get fuel when he comes back. We were about 3 miles away from home. It may not seem far, but walking in the dark on a dirt road, trees surrounding you on either side, with no streetlights, knowing that wolves or coyotes or even a cougar could attack you, that's a bit creepy. But we continued to walk. About a mile in, I started to hear someone throwing rocks at the trees lightly. I quickly told my mother, but she told me not to look or acknowledge the noise, because that's what they wanted. I began to understand what she meant. We kept on walking, not paying the forest any mind, until we heard a dog whimpering in the trees. Once again, I told my mother, but she told me the same thing. The noise started to change from a dog's to a man's voice, one that I remember clearly saying, "Hey, look, over here." I felt my body tense up, and my blood began to rush. I knew I couldn't look, but it kept saying my name, about 4 times in a row, and then it began to run ahead of us. I could make out a dark figure running between the trees. I know my mother saw it too, but she told me not to run, because then it would start chasing us. I listened to her, swallowing hard and trying my best not to be afraid. I asked her if she could hear it calling out to me, but she didn't. She said if I heard it again, I should ignore it as much as possible. So we kept walking, now only a mile away. It was then that we saw a dog in the middle of the road. It was a brown and black mutt, and it sat there looking at us while we walked around it. Now, my mother always has a little pouch of ashes that she kept all over the place for situations like this. She was just about to pull it out when the creature ran. My mother told me we would have to walk a little bit faster now. Then we heard the shrieks. They were loud, sounding like a rooster crowing, mixed with a dog yelping. We continued to walk at the same pace, until finally we made it back home, and we waited there for my father. But that didn't stop it from trying to bother us. Something began to knock on the door, just barely, and it was walking on the roof after that. My mother wasn't afraid, because she took out my grandfather's 12 gauge and held it till the noise went away. 3 hours later, my father came home to pick up my mother and to get the car in the road. Part 2. When I was 10 years old, we moved to a city. My parents dropped me off at my Inale during the summer break after the school year was over. One night I was alone. My family was in the city working, and my Inale went to a casino. I was at her place watching movies. I was also playing SpongeBob the Movie game on my GameCube. An underrated game, by the way. When I suddenly began to hear the dogs barking all around me. My family had a few dogs to let us know if something was around, but all of them began to bark, yet I didn't know why. But then I heard a light tapping on the window. I actually didn't go check, because by then I knew what it was. It began to get a little bit louder, trying to get my attention, but it stopped. Then it started to move along the walls, tapping all around. This time around, I was feeling more irritated, so I figured I'd do something about it. I got some ashes from the fireplace, and I placed them next to me in case it tried to get in. Then I continued to play the game, ignoring it. But then it crawled on the roof, and I could hear it walking around up there. In my head, I was like, what the heck? This dude really got on the roof. It kept on going until my Nale came home. I told her about it, and she laughed at me, saying that there was one that always did that crap, and asked if it scared me. I was honest with her and told her it did a little bit, but I ignored it after a while. She laughed again and told me to go to bed, and that was that. Part 3. The third incident happened when I was 13. This one I actually messed up, because I didn't put an ash circle around the house like my Nale told me to a couple of days before all the same stuff happened. It was nighttime, and I was starting to get sleepy around 9 or 10, so I went to bed. But while I slept, I had a horrible nightmare. I woke up in the dark. The only light I had on my face was through a window from the moonlight. This window was on the wall between the kitchen and living room where I was sleeping. I peered into the kitchen, which was pitch black. Everything seemed fine, so I tried to go back to sleep, when suddenly I felt just wrong. A feeling of dread came over me. I looked around again, but I couldn't see anything there, but I knew something was. I kept trying to search for something, when finally it moved slightly towards the light a bit. I was stunned. I was looking at this dark figure that had a head shaped like a dog's. Perhaps it was wearing the dog's skin. But I was immediately struck with the smell of wet dog, compost, and rotting animal. I froze, then desperately tried to call out to my Nale, but my voice felt as if it was being squeezed. I could only let out a hoarse whisper. I looked back at the figure, but it didn't move. It seemed to be staring in at me. For the next several minutes, heck, it could have been an hour, I couldn't do anything. I decided to try to ignore it, like my parents always told me. So I turned around and I squeezed my eyelids shut. The following day, the sun shone through all around, and I remembered immediately what happened last night. My Nale walks up to me asking if I woke up earlier. I asked her why. She said, well, because someone left the front door open. That creeped me out, and now that I'm older, I think I've gotten used to them. And luckily, I know what to do when the worst happens. Sleeping Creature, from Eveline S. This encounter took place 10 years ago in a forest located between Besançon and Ornon in the east of France. I must first of all say that I've always loved nature. As a child until I was a teenager, I used to get up early in the morning before everyone, around 6 a.m. I went out in muffled steps to avoid waking my parents and brothers. I would go for a walk every morning in the wilderness for 2 hours, before returning to have breakfast and to go to school. So I was used to my solitary walks for a long time. Later on, I would have to give up this habit, because I had to leave to continue my studies, and because I was a boarder in high school. The years have passed. In 2009, as in previous years, I used to go to a forest near Ornon to look for mushrooms. I could go far enough without ever feeling the least concern. It was a beautiful coniferous forest. That week, it was in August. I was unusually nervous out there, and I didn't really understand why. The weather was gorgeous, but something bothered me. Several times I rushed to pick up my mushrooms, and I would quickly leave the woods, then jump into my car, leaving as fast as possible. On the way back, I said to myself, "What's wrong with you?" But hey, I forgot about it and came back the next day. It was then that I finally understood the reason for my concern. After picking up some mushrooms, I got up and understood what was bothering me. It was the silence there. I listened. I could hear my heart beating extra hard, but nothing else. Once again, I left quickly. One morning I arrived around 7:30. It was the best time to go for mushrooms before others passed through. I embarked on a trail that I had not explored yet. I soon stumbled upon a dark mass. It was about 60 meters away from me, but I could see it. I thought it was a tree stump at first. I began walking while looking at the ground, picking some mushrooms and going about my business. I eventually made it up to that mass, and I looked up in front of me. I was shocked. I tried to understand what I was looking at because it definitely was not a tree stump. It was some sort of animal, curled up on itself, muzzle resting on the chest. The posture was very strange. It looked like someone crouching. Its fur was a black-gray, like that of a boar, but darker. And above all, it wasn't a boar either. I know what a boar looks like, my companion being a hunter himself. My heart began to beat like crazy again. I could hear it thumping through my ears. I was terrified this creature would hear it. I began to recoil and backstep. My fear was so visceral. I'd never felt that way before. I ended up spinning and running without daring to return. I made it back to my car and pressed the accelerator. Back home, I didn't dare tell my companion about this. I simply asked him if he'd ever come up on a boar sleeping or sitting. Of course, he laughed at me, wondering why I asked such a sudden and odd question. During the day one day, I decided to return to the scene. I cautiously advanced my car up the trail, and I leaned over to watch, and that supposed stump was gone. So what I had walked up on was definitely a living creature of some sort. From that day forward, I didn't go that deep into the woods anymore. If I was going back in for mushrooms, I would only go back in a few meters. About a year ago, I saw Nuria TV's show about the Dogman, myth or reality, and this is where I'll put a name to what I saw, because the reports that show talks about, they're very similar to what I saw. Which animal do you think would sleep squatting like a person? Creature by the Tent, from Insulting. There's always something that happens in your life that you'll never forget, and this is one of them. It happened 15 years ago when I was 14. It was a simple camping trip with my family and my best friend Brian. We live in a small town in West Virginia, and this creepy encounter happened on a small camping spot down in Lower Glady. This was the first time I was allowed to bring a friend camping, and I wanted to bring someone who knew about fishing and nature. Brian was a sure pick and was one of my best friends at the time. We packed up early and left to pick him up at his grandparents' house. It's only around 50 minutes or so to get to the camping spot, but let me tell you, it's in the lower mountains and far away from anyone else or any sort of help. Once we got there, we set up camp. Me and Brian had our own tent while my parents set up their tent across from us. Our tent, because we were living dangerously, was set up right next to a tree line with a bunch of vegetation blocking our sight from looking into the forest. The campsite was kind of in the open, but surrounded by trees and a nice creek for fishing. So after we set up, me and Brian went with my dad to try and catch some rainbow trout for cooking. This is where the first part of the encounter happened. As anyone knows, when you're young, your parents won't believe you most of the time when you see something odd. While fishing, we all three kind of split up to cover more water holes. As I throw my spinner in the water, bam, I got a monster rainbow right on the line. While I'm fighting this fish, I swear I could see a shadow of a tall figure across the creek. It was looking down at me from behind a tree. I began to look at it when my dad yelled at me, telling me he's coming and he's bringing the net. Just as he says that, I look towards him, then back at the tree, and the figure is gone. After I fight the fish for a while and we net the beauty, I proceed to tell my dad what I saw, but he shrugs it away, like I was just overly excited and didn't see anything. We head back to camp. The fire is burning hot and we're cooking this big fish up. While it's cooking, I'm in my tent with Brian and was telling him about what I saw. Believe it or not, he swears he saw the figure too. But for him, he saw it behind a different tree, which means there were multiple creatures, and all of them were watching me pull that trout out. After all that chatting, we began to eat dinner. It was getting dark out then. My dad brings out his American honey whiskey and starts hitting it hard. Around 11 p.m. or so, he's passed out next to the fire, lying on the trunk of a tree, while my mom was smart enough to get in their tent and pass out. Of course, me and Brian were young and full of energy, and we wanted to stay up late. We're starting to tell ghost stories, trying to scare each other. That's when we began to hear branches starting to bend and break outside the tent. Just then, something gets knocked off the table outside and onto the ground. I'm sitting there under my sleeping bag, absolutely terrified. Brian looks at me and says we have to see what it is. So we get up and we slowly start to unzip the zipper. It's just a doe. Her front legs are on the table and she's chewing on some bread we left out. We get out of the tent and the deer is still eating away, even though we're only a few feet from it. Just as I take a step, what sounded like someone knocking a freaking tree down sounds off to our right. The deer jerks up and looks at us, then looks back in the woods before taking off. Brian, being the idiot he was, takes a big rock from the ground and chucks it into the air and towards the woods. We can hear the rock crashing down through the branches, but just then, instead of a light sound of the rock hitting the ground, we hear this horrible, terrible scream of some animal yelling in the woods. We look at each other, then jump back into our tent. We zip the zipper up and get under the sleeping bag. Just as we do that, we can hear branches snapping and bushes moving around. I look at Brian and said, "Holy crap, something's coming." The firelight made a shadow of it on our tent. It was huge, some sort of animal. All I could see was an outline of possibly a man or something bigger. It seemed to be 7 feet or so, and the fingers on its hands ended in points. I look over at Brian, and I whispered to him, "My dad's out there." As much as I wanted to be a hero, I couldn't move from our tent. All I could do was hide under my sleeping bag as I heard the table being knocked over and our food being torn up. But as fast as it happened, it was gone. We wanted to look outside the tent, but were so scared that we ended up falling asleep while hiding in our sleeping bags. At daybreak, the light comes through the tent. I jump up and out of my sleeping bag and open the tent zipper. And my dad is there, still fast asleep in the same spot. He's perfectly fine. As for everything else, it looked like a tornado came ripping through the campsite, knocking everything over. Brian started tapping me. He then pointed into the woods, and you could actually see where something huge knocked over some small dead trees, smashed through some bushes, and even left somewhat of a dirty hand or claw print on the side of my tent. My parents still didn't believe us despite seeing all of this. They shrugged it off as a bear. After we packed up, Brian and I told my parents 1 second we were going to walk in the woods and look at something. What we actually looked at was the rock that he threw, but what we found was much worse. It was a doe, maybe the one from the night before, its belly ripped open, legs mangled. They never believed us anyway, so we never told my parents about what we found. And sadly, Brian never went camping with me again. But would you? Hush, don't be scared anymore. The masked phantoms, the walkers of skin, and those weird canine monsters in the woods, they're gone now. But they'll be back. They always come back. Just as you and I eat 2 or 3 times a day, those things in the woods need their prey. Be careful. Good night. If you enjoyed this episode of Darkness Prevails, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. If you have a story of your own, and you want other people to read it, or even have me narrate it, share it with us at darkstories.org. If you want to support the show, check the links below. There's a link to my Patreon where you can donate, or you can check out my merch store where you can buy some creepy shirts. Now, as usual, here are my 5 favorite early comments from the previous episode about 5 real encounters with the Dog Man. Bedwer Howell says, "Woof. Hush boy, you're gonna get us kicked out of the apartment." Mr. Lemons 12 says, "I just love Dogman stories." Well, stay tuned, Mr. Lemons, because man-dog stories are coming next. Man-dogs are notorious about complaining about their arthritis. Rachel Rader says, "This is why I carry milk bones in my pocket." Well, when I was little, I used to like the taste of dog food, so I'd probably love some milk bones. Vegan Jinx says, "They're supposed to be one of the mountains 45 minutes from where I live in North Carolina. Pretty wild." Hey, if you decide to film it, live stream it. I want to see that. Moon Princess says, "Call me crazy, but I'd love to see a dog man, werewolf, or anything supernatural, really." A lot of us here would, but I don't think we realize just how dangerous that might be. Oh well, worth it. And Ryder Walton says, "I just imagine one of these dog men has to be a pug. And he'd be extra cute, even if he had some breathing problems." Well, that brings us to the end of this Darkness Prevails episode. But don't you worry, because more scary stories are on the way soon. So stay tuned. Until next time, here are the credits to my amazing patrons who continue to donate. They're awesome people. Remember, stay safe out there, and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.